Buck Jacob Lowe from Mountain Monsters has been keeping a devastating secret for years. The ATV accident that nearly killed him and left him with permanent injuries wasn't just a routine mishap on familiar trails. It was caused by a terrifying Bigfoot encounter that producers forced him to cover up. For years, Buck has lived with chronic pain, addiction struggles, and the burden of knowing he encountered something real while the show around him faked evidence for ratings. Now, Buck is finally breaking his silence about what really happened that day, why the network buried the truth, and the evidence he's kept hidden that proves his story. The revelation will expose one of the biggest cover-ups in paranormal television history and validate what cryptid hunters have believed all along. Make sure you're subscribed because Buck is about to prove that the most genuine encounter in Mountain Monsters history was the one Travel Channel worked hardest to hide from viewers. Buck Jacob Lowe's social media post dropped like a bomb on the Mountain Monsters fan community in late January 2025. After years of relative silence following his departure from the show, Buck posted a lengthy statement on Facebook that began with words that immediately grabbed attention. "It's time I told you the truth about what really happened to me, and why I can never go back to that mountain again." The post was raw, emotional, and clearly written by someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Buck explained that legal restrictions and non-disclosure agreements had prevented him from speaking openly about his accident, but those restrictions had finally expired, freeing him to share the full story. Within minutes, the post had hundreds of comments from shocked fans demanding details. What truth had Buck been forced to hide? Why were there legal restrictions around what seemed like a simple ATV accident? The cryptic nature of Buck's announcement sparked immediate speculation across paranormal forums, Reddit threads, and YouTube channels. Some fans theorized Buck was finally going to expose Mountain Monsters as completely fake, confessing that everything was scripted and staged. Others wondered if Buck was revealing serious behind-the-scenes conflicts with cast members or production companies. A few perceptive fans noticed Buck's specific phrasing, "what really happened on that mountain," and began speculating that maybe the accident wasn't as straightforward as viewers had been told. Buck followed up his initial post with a promise to reveal everything in a forthcoming video interview, stating he had evidence that will prove what I'm about to tell you and why the network never wanted this story to come out. The mention of evidence intrigued the community even more. What could Buck possibly have that Travel Channel feared? His final comment in that initial post sent chills through longtime Mountain Monsters viewers. "The most real thing that ever happened during all our years hunting cryptids is the thing they made me lie about. The creature that nearly killed me was real, and I'm done protecting people who cared more about their liability than the truth." The cryptid hunting community exploded with theories. Buck was claiming an actual creature encounter, not just another staged investigation, but one that had been covered up rather than celebrated. This contradicted everything fans thought they knew about his accident. Buck's detailed account of what happened that September afternoon in 2018 reads like something from a horror film, but he insists every word is true and he has evidence to prove it. Buck was riding his ATV on private property adjacent to where Mountain Monsters frequently filmed, an area he'd traversed hundreds of times over decades of living in Appalachia. He knew every trail, every turn, and every potential hazard on that land. What he didn't expect was to encounter a massive bipedal creature standing in a clearing approximately 75 yards ahead of him. Buck initially thought it was a person, maybe a hunter or hiker who'd wandered onto private land, but as he slowed his ATV and got a clearer view, he realized this was something else entirely. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall with dark brown hair covering its entire body except for its face, which Buck describes as a horrifying mix of human and ape features. The smell hit him next, a putrid, musky odor that made his eyes water even from that distance. Buck sat frozen on his idling ATV for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. The creature noticed him. It turned its massive head, made direct eye contact with Buck, and released a vocalization that Buck describes as the most terrifying sound he'd ever heard. A combination of roar and scream that seemed impossibly loud and resonated in his chest. Then it charged. The creature moved with shocking speed for something so large, covering the distance between them faster than seemed physically possible. Buck reacted on pure instinct, twisting the throttle and attempting to turn the ATV around to flee back down the trail. In his panic and the desperate need for speed on rough terrain, Buck lost control. The ATV hit a large rock, partially hidden in tall grass, sending Buck airborne before slamming him into the ground and rolling the vehicle over his lower back and legs. He remembers the immediate explosion of pain, the inability to move his legs, and the terrifying realization that the creature was still somewhere nearby. Buck could hear it crashing through the brush, circling his position, apparently curious about what had happened but maintaining distance from the wrecked ATV. Buck lay in agony for nearly 20 minutes before help arrived, unable to move and terrified the creature would return. A family member who'd heard the ATV crash found him and called emergency services. Buck tried explaining what had chased him, but in his injured, traumatized state, his rescuers assumed he was confused or hallucinating from pain. By the time paramedics arrived and transported Buck to the hospital, word had already reached Mountain Monsters producers that one of their cast members had been seriously injured. The medical diagnosis was devastating: multiple fractured vertebrae, severe herniated discs, and nerve damage that would require immediate surgery and months of rehabilitation with no guarantee of full recovery. While Buck was still in the hospital recovering from emergency spinal surgery, he received visits from Travel Channel executives and production company lawyers that he describes as more interrogation than wellness check. They asked detailed questions about exactly what had happened, whether anyone else witnessed the encounter, and crucially, whether Buck had captured any video or photographic evidence of the creature. When Buck explained that he'd encountered a Bigfoot that charged him causing the accident, the lawyer's demeanor immediately shifted. They explained very clearly that Buck could not, under any circumstances, publicly claim his accident was caused by a cryptid encounter. The reasons were legal and financial. Without video evidence proving a creature was present, Buck's claim was legally just an allegation that could expose the production company and network to massive liability. If Buck was injured by an actual dangerous animal on a location where Mountain Monsters had been filming, it raised questions about whether proper safety protocols had been followed and whether the production had knowingly put cast members in danger. Insurance companies would investigate, lawsuits could follow, and the show itself might be canceled if it was determined that cryptid hunting posed genuine safety risks that weren't being properly managed. Buck was presented with revised non-disclosure agreements that specifically prohibited him from discussing the circumstances of his accident beyond describing it as a routine ATV mishap. If he violated these terms, he would be immediately removed from the show, forfeit any future compensation, and potentially face legal action for breach of contract. Buck, vulnerable and medicated in a hospital bed, signed the agreements under duress. Buck's recovery from spinal surgery required powerful prescription opioids to manage the excruciating pain that became his constant companion. Doctors prescribed OxyContin, Percocet, and eventually fentanyl patches for pain that simply wouldn't subside even months after the accident. What began as legitimate medical treatment for serious injuries gradually transformed into dependency that Buck didn't recognize until it had completely taken over his life. The pain from his injuries was real and debilitating, but Buck found himself taking pills not just for physical relief, but to numb the psychological trauma of the Bigfoot encounter and the guilt of lying about what had really happened. Every time someone asked about his accident and Buck repeated the rehearsed story about hitting a rock on a familiar trail, he felt like a fraud. The pills helped silence that voice of shame temporarily. Buck admits he began taking more than prescribed, convincing himself that the extra doses were medically necessary, when in reality, he was chasing the euphoric escape the medications provided from both physical and emotional agony. When doctors tried to reduce his prescriptions as healing progressed, Buck doctor shopped to maintain his supply, visiting multiple physicians and pharmacies to obtain overlapping prescriptions. He became skilled at manipulating medical professionals, exaggerating symptoms, and playing up his injuries to justify continued high-dose opioid therapy long after it was medically appropriate. The addiction affected his behavior during Mountain Monsters filming in ways that crew members noticed but production largely ignored. Buck would show up to investigations visibly impaired, slurring words, moving with the slow deliberateness of someone heavily medicated. There were moments captured on camera where Buck seemed confused or disconnected, staring blankly while other cast members discussed investigation strategies. Editors worked around his worst moments, cutting scenes where Buck's impairment was too obvious to hide. Other cast members confronted Buck privately about showing up to dangerous nighttime investigations in the woods while clearly under the influence of something. The concerns were both personal. They cared about Buck's well-being, and practical. An impaired team member put everyone at risk during investigations in rough terrain and potentially dangerous situations. Buck became defensive and denied having any problem, insisting he was only taking prescribed medications for legitimate injuries. The intervention finally came when Buck's family discovered the extent of his addiction after finding multiple pill bottles from different doctors and pharmacies hidden throughout his home. The decision to cover up Buck's Bigfoot encounter was calculated and deliberate, driven by legal liability concerns that overwhelmed any consideration of honoring what may have been a genuine cryptid experience. Travel Channel's insurance policies for mountain monsters covered injuries sustained during normal production activities, slips, falls, equipment accidents, and other predictable hazards of filming in wilderness locations. But injuries caused by actual dangerous wildlife or cryptid creatures opened an entirely different legal nightmare that insurers explicitly excluded from coverage. If Buck's encounter was real and the network acknowledged it, they'd be admitting that Mountain Monsters cast members faced genuine danger from creatures the show was supposedly investigating. This would trigger immediate insurance investigations, potential policy cancellations, and liability exposure worth millions if Buck or other cast members filed injury lawsuits claiming inadequate safety protocols. Production companies and networks maintain detailed safety procedures for reality television, including wildlife protocols, location assessments, and emergency response plans. Acknowledging that a cast member was attacked by an unknown creature would reveal that all those safety procedures were inadequate for the actual risks involved. Regulatory agencies, including OSHA, could investigate whether proper workplace safety standards were being followed. State film commissions might revoke permits for future productions. The legal department's worst-case scenario involved Buck's encounter becoming public and inspiring other cast or crew members to come forward with their own cryptid experiences that had been downplayed or ignored. If a pattern emerged of genuine dangerous encounters being covered up while the show simultaneously marketed itself as documenting real cryptid investigations, the network faced potential fraud claims from viewers and advertisers. Lawsuits alleging deceptive business practices could expose the show's scripted elements and staged evidence to legal scrutiny. Beyond liability, there was a cynical calculation about credibility. Mountain Monsters had been accused for years of faking evidence and staging encounters. If Buck came forward claiming a real Bigfoot attack caused his accident, skeptics would assume it was just another publicity stunt to boost ratings. The story seemed too convenient. A cast member of a cryptid hunting show just happens to have a genuine encounter off camera with no footage to prove it. Critics would mock the claim mercilessly, potentially doing more damage to the show's reputation than simply saying nothing. The network decided that silence was the safest option legally, financially, and reputationally. John Trapper Tice was one of the few people Buck confided in about what really happened, and Trapper's reaction revealed a man deeply conflicted about what Mountain Monsters had become versus what he'd originally envisioned. Buck reached out to Trapper while still recovering in the hospital, needing to talk with someone who would understand both the magnitude of encountering a real cryptid and the complicated position the network had put him in. Trapper listened to Buck's account without interruption, then said something Buck will never forget. "I believe you completely, and I'm sorry this happened to you in more ways than one." Trapper explained that he'd had his own unexplained encounters over years of genuinely hunting cryptids in Appalachia, long before television got involved. He'd seen things he couldn't explain, heard vocalizations that didn't match any known animal, and found evidence that convinced him something unknown lived in those mountains. But he'd also watched Mountain Monsters transform from a show about legitimate investigation into something increasingly staged and scripted to meet network demands for dramatic content. Trapper was furious that producers were forcing Buck to hide a genuine encounter while simultaneously faking evidence for episodes. The hypocrisy disgusted him. The one real cryptid experience that could validate everything they'd been claiming was being buried for legal and financial reasons, while manufactured drama was presented as authentic investigation. Trapper confronted producers about the Buck situation, arguing they should find a way to tell his story that respected both the truth and legitimate legal concerns. The network refused, and Trapper's relationship with production became increasingly strained. In private conversations during Buck's recovery period, Trapper shared his own regrets about how the show had evolved. He felt complicit in deceiving fans who genuinely believed in their work, and the Buck situation crystallized his concerns about the ethical problems inherent in paranormal entertainment television. Trapper encouraged Buck to prioritize his health and well-being over the show, even if that meant walking away entirely. He offered to support Buck publicly if he ever decided to tell the truth, regardless of consequences from the network. Those conversations meant everything to Buck during his darkest period. Trapper's death, less than a year later, hit Buck especially hard because he'd lost not just a team leader, but the one person who fully understood and validated his experience. Buck's secret about the Bigfoot encounter created a fracture within the Ames team that never fully healed, dividing cast members between those who believed his story and supported him versus those who thought he was lying or exaggerating for attention and sympathy. The division started almost immediately after Buck returned to filming following his recovery. He confided in select team members about what had really happened, hoping for understanding and support from people he'd worked alongside for years. Wild Bill was among the first Buck told, and his reaction was unexpectedly harsh. Wild Bill expressed skepticism about the encounter, suggesting that Buck's pain medications and trauma had caused him to misinterpret what he'd seen. He pointed out that convenient off-camera encounters without evidence were exactly the kind of thing skeptics accused the show of fabricating. Wild Bill's dismissal felt like betrayal to Buck, who'd expected his longtime friend to believe him unconditionally. Their relationship deteriorated from that point, with Buck feeling unsupported during the most difficult period of his life, while Wild Bill felt Buck was being irresponsible by spreading unprovable claims that could damage the show's credibility. The argument escalated into accusations about who was really loyal to the team and whether Buck's addiction issues were affecting his judgment about what had actually happened. Other cast members took sides. Willie McQuillian believed Buck's story completely, having had his own unexplained experiences in Appalachian wilderness that he'd never shared publicly. Willie became one of Buck's strongest advocates, arguing that the team should support Buck rather than question him. Jeff was more neutral, acknowledging he didn't know what happened but felt the network's handling of the situation was wrong, regardless of whether Buck's encounter was real. The division went beyond just believing or disbelieving Buck's story. It exposed deeper tensions about the show's authenticity and what the cast owed each other versus what they owed the production. Some cast members prioritized protecting Mountain Monster's reputation and their own financial interests, viewing Buck's story as a liability that could jeopardize everyone's paychecks if it went public. Others felt that loyalty to a team member who was genuinely suffering should outweigh business concerns. Filming became awkward and tense, with unresolved conflicts simmering beneath every investigation. Buck felt increasingly isolated, dealing with chronic pain and addiction while surrounded by people who either didn't believe him or wanted him to stay quiet for the good of the show. What producers and cast members didn't know was that Buck had collected physical evidence from the encounter site that he'd kept hidden for years, waiting for the right time to reveal proof that would validate his story. In the chaotic aftermath of his accident, while waiting for emergency responders, Buck used his phone to photograph massive footprints he could see from where he lay injured on the ground. The prints were approximately 18 inches long, deeply impressed in the soft earth near where the creature had been standing, showing clear toe definition and dermal ridges that Buck knew were consistent with alleged Bigfoot tracks documented by researchers. He took over a dozen photos from different angles despite excruciating pain, knowing these images might be his only evidence of what had really happened. Buck also recorded audio on his phone during those terrifying 20 minutes before help arrived. The recording captures his labored breathing, groans of pain, and most importantly, distant vocalizations from the creature that had apparently remained in the area after Buck crashed. The sounds are deep, guttural, and unlike any known wildlife in West Virginia. Audio analysis experts Buck later consulted privately confirmed the vocalizations didn't match bear, elk, or any other animal native to Appalachia. Before emergency crews arrived, Buck managed to crawl several feet to collect physical evidence. Tufts of dark hair caught on vegetation where the creature had crashed through the brush. He stuffed the hair samples into his jacket pocket, protecting them even as paramedics worked on him. Buck had the samples analyzed by a private laboratory under a false name, paying cash to avoid any paper trail that might alert producers. The lab results showed primate hair with characteristics inconsistent with any known ape species, though the lab couldn't definitively identify the source. The most compelling evidence Buck preserved was the actual location data and timestamps from his phone proving exactly when and where the encounter occurred. GPS coordinates, photo metadata, and cell tower records document his position at the time of the accident, allowing independent verification that he was exactly where he claimed to be. Buck kept all this evidence hidden for years, stored in a secure location known only to his closest family members, waiting until he was legally free to reveal it without violating his non-disclosure agreements with the network. Buck's decision to permanently leave Mountain Monsters and finally reveal the truth about his Bigfoot encounter represents a complete transformation from the person who once prioritized television fame and paychecks over personal integrity. His journey through addiction recovery provided the clarity and courage necessary to walk away from the show and face the consequences of telling a story the network desperately wants to remain buried. Buck completed his final contracted episodes in 2023 while counting down the days until his non-disclosure agreements would expire. Every moment of filming felt dishonest and unbearable now that he'd achieved sobriety and could no longer use substances to numb the guilt of lying about his experience. He watched producers stage evidence and script encounters while sitting on proof of a genuine cryptid interaction that was being actively suppressed. The hypocrisy became too much to tolerate. In early 2025, when his legal restrictions finally expired, Buck made the definitive choice to tell his story regardless of professional and financial consequences. He's prepared for lawsuits from the network claiming he's violating the spirit of his agreements even if technically legal restrictions have lapsed. He's accepted that speaking out means he'll never work in paranormal television again and that many people will dismiss his claims as attention-seeking fabrication. But Buck has come to believe that his recovery and continued sobriety depend on living authentically and telling the truth about what happened to him. The lies were literally making him sick, contributing to depression and anxiety that threatened his hard-won sobriety. Buck's plans for revealing his evidence are deliberate and strategic. He's partnering with credible Bigfoot researchers and wildlife biologists to analyze and present his photos, audio recordings, and physical samples in a way that withstands scientific scrutiny. He's considering publishing a book that tells the complete story of his encounter, the network cover-up, and his struggle with addiction and recovery. Most importantly, Buck wants his story to validate other people who've had genuine cryptid encounters but remained silent due to fear of ridicule or professional consequences. He hopes that by coming forward with evidence and accepting the personal costs of honesty, he can encourage others to share their experiences and contribute to legitimate cryptozoological research rather than entertainment television's staged fakery.